In a low room above a boatyard, a girl watched her father heat something dark in a small iron pot. The smell was sharp, pine tar and flax oil mixing in the lamplight until the air itself felt thick. He brushed the mixture into a square of sailcloth, slow and even, and the cloth went stiff and dark under his hands. Then he pressed her palm to the back of it and told her to feel. On one side, tiny currents against her skin. On the other, nothing, just stillness. 13 years later, she needed that stillness to keep her brother alive. The shack stood 14 by 18 feet on a flat of frozen mud 3 miles south of the Medora Depot. And it was not a house by any honest measure. It was a single wall plank box thrown together by a freight hand who had quit the territory after one freeze, sold cheap, and never looked back. Ragina Lunde walked its perimeter with a hammer in one hand and a scrap of ledger paper in the other, counting what she had. One iron stove with a cracked firebox lip, one window on the south wall, barely 2 feet square, the glass wavy and already chipped at the corner, missing battens on the east side where daylight showed in pale seams between boards, a roof boarded fast and gapped at the eaves, so that standing inside you could hear the wind, not as a single note, but as a chorus, each crack singing its own pitch. She had paid $47 for the structure and improvements. Not for the land. Land came through residence and proof under the Homestead Act, and she had filed her claim in her own name, which was her legal right, and which had cost her 2 days of argument with a clerk who did not believe a woman could hold paper without a husband's signature. Her husband was dead. Crushed chest in the Mandan freight yard in July. He had left her a half-finished claim, $11 in debt to a hardware supplier, and a brother too young to swing an axe at full weight. Ivor stood at the south window pressing his thumb into a crack where cold air whistled through. He was 11, thin-armed, serious, quiet in the way children become when they have watched adults fail. He did not ask whether the house would hold. He asked whether wind could come through wood all winter long. Ragna did not answer because she did not have an answer yet. What she had, written on the ledger scrap in pencil, so faint she had to hold it near the stove to read, $18. That was everything left after the freight cost of moving their goods from Mandan, after nails, after flour and salt pork, after a second-hand stovepipe she had bought from a widow at the rail stop who was leaving the territory for good. $18 to last from October through spring, to buy fuel, food, lamp oil, and whatever the house demanded before the cold came in earnest. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, and she went outside to look at the woodpile, less than a cord. Split pine and cottonwood stacked against the east wall, dry enough, but nowhere near enough. She had cut some of it herself with a borrowed bucksaw in the river break south of town, hauling it back on a sled she'd traded labor for. Ivor had helped drag the lighter pieces. The pile looked respectable if you did not know what a winter on the northern plains required. If you did know, it looked like a death sentence. The man who told her so arrived on the 4th day. Harlan Voss rode up on a dun gelding with a wool blanket thrown over the saddle, and a face that had survived 52 winters by never once pretending that the next one would be gentle. He was a stockman, a builder of heavier shelters, and a man whose word carried weight in the valley because his cattle were alive and his fences stood. He did not introduce himself with pleasantries. He swung down, tied the horse to the remains of a fence post, and walked the perimeter of the shack without being invited. Ragna watched him from the doorway. She did not stop him. There was no point. A man like Voss would say what he came to say regardless. He pressed his hand flat against the north wall and held it there. Then he crouched and looked under the eave gap where boards did not meet the roof edge cleanly. He stood and kicked the base of the east wall where the ground timber sat on bare earth. No stone footer, no packed gravel. He looked at the woodpile last. "You have half a frame," he said. "No real sill. No battens worth the name. Gaps I can see daylight through from inside. One stove, and from the look of the pipe, it draws poorly." "It draws," Ragna said. Voss ignored this. He pointed at the woodpile. "That is one cord at best, and I am being generous. To winter here, To genuinely winter here, with a child in the house, you need tight walls first. You need someone with a team to haul proper timber and close these joints. You need 6 cords of wood minimum, or the cash to buy coal or lignite at depot price, which right now is running $11 a ton and climbing because every rancher in the valley is buying against the same winter you are. You do not have 6 cords. You do not have a team. You do not have the money. Ragna said nothing. Voss pulled his gloves tighter and looked at her the way men looked at things they had already decided about. I'm not trying to be cruel, he said. I'm telling you what I would tell my own daughter. This house will not hold. The plains do not forgive what is underbuilt. You will burn through that pile by mid-December, and then you will be feeding the stove with furniture, and then you will be feeding it with nothing, and by January you and that boy will be in genuine danger. What would you have me do? Ragna asked. Sell what you can carry. Take the loss. Go back east before the passes close. Ragna looked at the shack, at the single square of glass catching late afternoon light, at the smoke threading up from the stovepipe and bending hard to the southeast, which meant the northwest wind was already building. I have $47 in this structure, she said. I have a filed claim with 6 months of residence already counted. I have a brother with no relatives east of Ohio and no money for passage. If I leave, I lose the claim. I lose the improvement, and I arrive in a city with a child and nothing. Voss mounted his horse. You will lose more than that if you stay, he said. He rode north without looking back, and the sound of the hooves on frozen ground faded into the wind, and the wind kept going. That night Ragna sat at the plank table with the stove banked low. She was already rationing, already counting, and did the math again. 6 cords of wood meant 600 board feet of cut timber, split and stacked and dried. A strong man with a good axe and a team to haul could put up a cord in 2 hard days. She had no team. She had a borrowed bucksaw and a boy who weighed 80 pounds. At her pace, with the days shortening, she could cut and haul perhaps half a cord per week if the weather held and nothing else demanded her time. That gave her 2.5 cords by the end of November. Maybe 3 if she stopped sleeping. 3 cords against a winter that would need 6. Half of what survival required. And even if she had the fuel, the house itself was the problem. She could feel it now, lying in the dark with Ivor asleep on the cot against the south wall. The wind did not knock. It entered. Through every unsealed joint, every gap where battens should have been, every place where the boards had shrunk or warped, the cold came in as moving air. The stove threw heat, and the walls gave it back to the prairie as fast as the iron could produce it. She was not heating a house. She was heating the sky through a sieve. The doubt was worst at night. Voss was not wrong. The math was the math. She did not have enough fuel, enough money, enough hands, or enough time. She had a dead husband, a thin brother, and a box of boards that the first real blizzard would turn into a coffin. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind find every seam, and she did not sleep until the stove needed feeding at 3 a.m, and by then the water in the pail had skinned with ice. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived in pieces, over days, the way understanding sometimes does when the mind is too exhausted for revelation, but too desperate to stop working. The first piece came at the Medora depot. Rosna had walked the 3 miles to town for flour and to ask about work, any work, washing or mending or hauling, anything that paid cash before the ground froze solid. The depot was busy with late-season freight, wagons lined up for the last reliable shipments before winter locked the roads. She stood near the loading dock, waiting to speak with the station agent about laundry work for the rail hands, and while she waited, she watched a teamster lash a heavy tarpaulin over a load of milled lumber. The canvas was old freight stock, stiff and dark with use, patched in 2 places and re-grommeted where the original brass had torn free. The teamster pulled it tight across the load and cinched it at the corners, and when he was finished, the lumber underneath was sealed. She could see the canvas move in the gusts. It bellied and snapped, but the load stayed dry. Rain 2 days earlier had soaked every exposed surface in the yard, but under the tarp, the boards were pale and clean. She watched the wind hit the canvas and slide off it, and something turned in her mind like a key finding a lock. That night, the second piece arrived. She was sitting by the stove, mending a tear in Ivor's coat, when the smell of hot iron and wood smoke mixed in the air and carried her back to a room she had not thought about in years, her father's sail loft in Haugesund. A long, low room above the boatyard, where Halvor Lunde had stretched and treated canvas for the fishing fleet. She had been 8, maybe 9. Her father had taken a piece of wet sailcloth and pinned it across a wooden frame, and then he had heated pine tar in a small iron pot and cut it with linseed oil until the mixture ran like dark honey. He brushed the mixture into the cloth with slow, even strokes, and the canvas changed under his hands. It went from limp and porous to tight and dark and nearly rigid. He told her to press her hand against the back of the treated section and then against the untreated section beside it. "Feel the difference," he said. She felt it. On the untreated side, air moved through the weave in tiny currents she could sense against her palm. On the treated side, nothing. The cloth was not warm, but the air was still. "Cloth fails from wet," her father said, "but people die from moving air. Stop the air and you have changed the problem." She had filed that lesson somewhere below conscious memory, the way children file things they do not yet need. Now, 13 years later, with the wind threading through every joint in her walls and the woodpile shrinking by the day, the lesson surfaced with the force of something that had been waiting. The walls were boards. Boards had gaps. Gaps let air move. Moving air stole heat faster than any stove could replace it. The conventional answer was to fight the gaps with more boards, more battens, more caulking, more labor and more money she did not have. But there was another answer. Cover the outside with a continuous skin that the wind could not penetrate, not boards over boards, cloth over boards, treated cloth, tarred, oiled, stretched tight, that would seal every crack, every joint, every warped edge in a single unbroken layer. And if the cloth were darkened, blackened with soot worked into the tar, the south and west walls would warm under a winter sun instead of reflecting it back. Not magical heat, just physics, a dark surface absorbing what a pale surface refused. Combined with stopping the drafts, even a small stove could hold its own. She sat up in the dark, and for the first time in weeks the math changed. Not more fuel, less loss. The plan took shape over 2 days of walking, thinking, and counting. She needed heavy canvas, at least 5 large tarps, each roughly 12 by 16 feet, enough to cover the walls and wrap the vulnerable joints at the corners and eaves. She needed pine tar and linseed oil for the treatment. She needed tacks, a hammer, scrap battens for seam strips, and time. The canvas she could get at the depot. Old freight tarps were discarded regularly, torn, stained, retired from service when new stock arrived. The station agent might sell them cheap or trade for labor. Pine tar was available in Medora. It was used for everything from wagon axles to fence posts. Linseed oil cost more, but she needed less of it, just enough to thin the tar for penetration into cloth fibers. The cost would eat most of her remaining $18. That was the gamble stated plainly. Spend the money on canvas and treatment instead of on fuel. If the method worked, she would need far less fuel to heat a tighter house. If it failed, she would have a tarred shack and no wood, and no money to buy more. Ivar listened to her explain it. He was 11, but he was Norwegian, and Norwegian children on the plains learned to calculate survival before they learned to read English well. He looked at the stovepipe, looked at the cracks in the wall, and said one word. "When?" "Now," Ragna said, "before the ground freezes too hard to drive tacks." Marta Kroll arrived with bread and doubt on the same morning. She was 36, a mother of 3, settled on a larger claim 2 miles east, with a husband who ran cattle and cut timber, and still worried every winter about fuel. Marta was not cruel. She was practical in the way that women who have buried a child and nearly lost another to croup become practical. She did not believe in cleverness. She believed in cordwood and thick walls, and preparation measured in weight, not ideas. She stood in Ragnar's kitchen, such as it was, a corner with a shelf and a basin, and looked at the canvas Ragnar had already brought from the depot. 5 tarps, folded and stacked near the door, smelling of freight dust and old grease. "You are going to wrap your house in cloth," Marta said. It was not a question. "Treated cloth," Ragnar said, "tarred and oiled until it is wind-tight, stretched over the walls so the air cannot find the cracks." Marta picked up a corner of the top tarp and rubbed it between her fingers. "This cloth will rot by spring," she said. "It will collect snow and ice and pull away from the nails, and if it catches from a stove spark, you will have a burning tent around a wooden box with 2 people inside it." Ragnar had expected this. She had expected it because Marta's objections were her own objections, the ones she had argued with herself through 2 sleepless nights before deciding. "Treated canvas does not rot in 1 season," Ragnar said. "Ships use it for years. The tar resists flame better than dry wood, and the alternative is 3 cords of fuel against a winter that needs 6. Marta set the cloth down. "I have seen women try clever things out here," she said. "Most of the time the clever thing fails, and the woman wishes she had done the simple thing instead. Buy more wood, bank the north wall with sod. Do what works." "I cannot afford what works," Ragnar said. "I can afford what might work." Marta left the bread and took her doubt with her, and Ragnar stood in the kitchen looking at the 5 tarps and the shrinking daylight and the stovepipe leaking smoke from a joint she had not yet sealed, and she began. The coal merchant found out before the first tarp was hung. Silas Brame kept the only fuel supply between Medora and the river camps, and he had built his position the way such men always built their positions, by extending credit at terms that made payment difficult and default profitable. He was 48, thick-armed, patient in the way that creditors are patient, and he understood the economics of desperation better than anyone in the valley. Every fall, the same settlers came to him needing fuel they could not pay for, and every spring, a handful of those settlers signed over improvements they could no longer hold. Silas did not need blizzards. He only needed the fear of them. When word reached him that the young Norwegian widow was wrapping her shack in tarred canvas instead of buying coal, he walked to see it for himself. He found Ragnar on a ladder made of scrap lumber, tacking the top edge of a treated tarp along the south wall. The cloth was dark, nearly black where the soot and tar mixture had been worked deepest into the weave. It hung stiff in the cold air, not yet pulled tight, and against the raw plank wall it looked less like construction than like mourning. Silas stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her drive a tack with 3 precise strikes. She did not come down. She did not greet him. "Looks less like a house than a mourning box," Silas said. He said it loud enough for Ivor to hear from where the boy was holding the bottom edge of the tarp against the wall. Ragnar drove another tack. "I came to offer terms," Silas said. 2 tons of lignite delivered on credit through March. 8%. You sign the improvement as surety." She looked down at him for the first time. 8% monthly or 8% total, she said. Silas smiled. Monthly, as was standard. Ragnar knew what standard meant. 2 tons at $11 a ton was $22. 8% per month for 5 months was nearly $9 more. $31 total secured against a property worth $47. If she could not pay, and he knew she could not because no one in her position could, he would take the shack, the improvement, and the claim filing for a fraction of its value. She had seen him do it to a family north of the river the previous spring. The wife had been crying as they loaded the wagon. "I do not need coal," Ragnar said. Silas looked at the black cloth on the wall. He looked at the wood pile. He looked at the boy holding canvas in the wind with both hands. "You will," he said, "and when you do, the price will be higher." He left. Ragnar watched him go, then turned back to the wall and pulled the tarp tighter, stretching it down and outward the way her father had stretched sailcloth, strain distributed to the tack line, not concentrated at any single point. She trimmed the edge with a knife, folded the raw seam under, and drove the final tacks in a line so even it looked like stitching. The south wall was half covered. The sun was already low. She had 3 walls left and a roof to seal, and winter was coming like a train on schedule. Construction was a war against daylight and cold. Ragna rose before dawn and worked until her hands could no longer grip the hammer, then went inside to thaw her fingers over the stove and eat cold biscuit and start again. The process was brutal in its specificity. Each tarp had to be scrubbed clean of freight grease and dried flat. No easy task when the temperature was dropping daily, and the only drying method was draping the cloth over the south-facing wall in whatever sun remained. Then came the treatment. Heating pine tar in a kettle over an outdoor fire. The fumes were too heavy and too flammable for inside work, cutting it with linseed oil at a ratio. She adjusted by feel, stirring until the mixture ran smooth, then brushing and pressing it into the canvas with a flat stick and a rag wrapped over a block of wood. The tar burned if the kettle got too hot. The oil thickened if the air got too cold. The cloth stiffened as it cooled, which meant she had to work fast once the mixture was applied, stretching and tacking while the canvas was still pliable, pulling it smooth before it set into whatever shape it held. A wrinkle left loose was a wrinkle that would catch wind and snow. A seam left unsealed was a seam that would whistle all winter. Ever helped where he could. He held edges, passed tacks from a tin can hung on his belt, and kept the fire under the kettle fed with scraps. He could not lift the tarps alone. They weighed 30 pounds or more when treated, and he could not reach the eave line. But he was steady and he did not complain, and when his fingers went white and numb, he put them in his armpits and waited until feeling returned, and then went back to holding. The south wall went up first because it faced the sun. The west wall followed because it caught the worst of the afternoon wind. Each wall took 2 full days of labor from first light to dusk, 1 day for treatment and drying, 1 day for hanging and tacking. By the end of the first week, 2 walls were covered in dark, tight canvas that smelled of tar and flax and looked like nothing anyone in the valley had seen on a house before. The east wall brought the first real setback. The third tarp, older and more worn than the others, tore at the top corner when Ragna pulled it tight against a tack line. The tear ran 18 inches down the edge before she could stop it, and the sound of ripping canvas in the cold air was like a voice saying, "Quit." She stood on the ladder with the torn cloth in her hands, and the wind already finding the gap, and she felt the doubt that had lived in her chest since the day Voss rode away come surging up like water through cracked ice. She climbed down. She sat on the ground with her back against the east wall and her hands in her lap, and for 3 minutes she did not move. Ivor watched from the corner of the house, holding his tin of tacks, saying nothing. Then she stood up. She took the torn section inside, heated the tar kettle, cut a patch from the canvas scraps she had saved, and sewed and sealed it with thread, tar, and pressure. The patch was ugly. It held. She finished the east wall that afternoon. 3 walls sealed. The north wall remained, the wall that mattered most, the wall that faced the winter wind, and she had 1 full tarp and part of another left, and the first snow was already falling in light, dry flakes that melted on the black canvas and ran off in dark streaks. The next morning, Silas Bream's delivery boy rode past on his way to a customer and slowed to stare at the black walls. By noon, 3 men outside the depot were laughing about the morning box south of town. Ragna heard about it from the station agent when she came for a spool of wire. She bought the wire, walked 3 miles home, and started on the north wall. If you have ever worked towards something the world called foolish, you know the particular loneliness of hammering tacks while laughter carries on the wind. Tell us about it in the comments. We'll be here. The north wall was the critical face. Northwest wind drove the worst weather across the valley floor, and every crack, every joint, every gap in the north boards was a direct pathway for cold moving air. Ragna overlapped the seams away from the prevailing wind, each panel lapping over the one below like shingles, so water and driven snow would slide down the face instead of catching at an edge. She doubled the tack spacing along the top line because the upper edge would take the most strain when gusts hit. She sealed the corner joints with narrow strips of treated canvas folded into the gap and tacked on both sides, so the transition from wall to wall was continuous. But the tacks were running short. She had bought 4 pounds at the hardware store in Medora, and she had used nearly 3 pounds on the first 3 walls. The north wall needed tighter spacing, which meant more tacks per foot, which meant she was going to run out before the roof edge. She counted what she had left. Enough for the north wall if she was careful. Not enough for the eave seals and the roof skirt that would protect the joint where walls met roof line, the most vulnerable point on the entire structure where wind could lift the cloth and peel it back in a single gust. One more dollar spent meant one less dollar for food. One less tack meant one more place where winter could get in. She chose the tacks. She walked to town in the morning dark, bought another pound, and walked back with snow crunching under her boots and the sky already the color of iron. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees overnight. The mud around the house had frozen into ridges and ruts that made the ladder footing treacherous. Her fingers cracked and bled where the skin had dried from tar and cold. She wrapped them in strips of old cotton, gripped the hammer, and kept going. By the end of the second week, 4 walls were covered. The house stood on the flat like something alien, a squat black box in a landscape of pale board and bare timber, conspicuous as a bruise. From a distance, it looked wrong. Up close, the canvas was drum-tight, the seams lapped clean, the tar surface dark and slightly tacky where the sun warmed it at midday. Press a hand to the south wall on a clear afternoon, and you could feel warmth in the cloth. Press a hand to the neighbor's bare boards, and you felt only the wind going through. But the roof was not sealed. The eaves were not capped. The stovepipe clearance, where the iron pipe passed through the roof boards, had no treated flashing around it, and the wind entered there as if invited. And Ragna had reached the limit of what she knew how to do alone. Walls were flat. She understood flat surfaces, stretch, tack, overlap, seal. But the junction where wall met roof was geometry of a different order, angles, transitions, stress points where wind would lift and peel if the cloth was not anchored correctly. Her father had taught her the principle. He had not taught her the joinery. She found the answer at the depot, and his name was Peder Flaten. Peder was 61, Norwegian-born like Ragna, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he worked. He was a former sailmaker from Bergen who had come west with the railroad and stayed when his lungs told him the sea air was finished. He repaired freight covers and canvas goods at the Medora depot for wages that kept him in tobacco and coffee and not much else. He was thin, coughed in the mornings, and walked with the careful economy of a man who knew his body was spending capital it could not replace. Ragna found him stitching a grain tarp in the depot shed, a curved sail needle moving through the cloth with the kind of rhythm that only comes from decades of the same motion. She had not come looking for him specifically. She had come to buy 2 more yards of scrap canvas for the eave seals, but she saw his hands, and she saw the needle, and she saw the way the finished seam lay flat and continuous without a single pucker, and she stopped. She told him what she was building. Not all of it, just the problem. Walls sealed, roof exposed, junctions vulnerable. She described the corner wraps and the lapped seams and the tar and oil treatment, and she watched his face change from polite disinterest to something sharper. He put the needle down. "You tarred the cloth before hanging," he said. "Not after." "Before," Ragna said. "Worked it into the weave while the mixture was warm." Peter looked at her with the expression of a man recognizing something familiar in an unexpected place. He asked how she had overlapped the seams. She told him. He asked which direction she had oriented the laps on the north wall. She told him. He asked whether she had doubled the tack spacing at the eave line. "I could not," she said. "I ran out of tacks." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The eave is where you will lose everything. You can have perfect walls and still die if the wind gets under the roof edge. Cloth fails progressively. It does not all go at once if the strain is distributed. But if the wind finds one loose corner at the eave, it will peel the whole face in a single gust. One corner is all it takes." "I know," Ragna said. "That is why I am here." Petter did not offer to help. He asked a question instead. He asked how long she had before the first hard freeze locked the ground. 3 weeks, she said, if the weather held. Maybe less. He looked at the canvas in his hands, at the needle, at the shed full of damaged freight tarps waiting for repair. Then he looked at Ragna. "Come back tomorrow with the boy," he said. "Bring whatever cloth you have left, and bring the tar." He did not explain why. Ragna did not ask. She knew what his hands could do, and she knew what recognition looked like in a craftsman's eyes. He was not offering charity. He was responding to someone who had already done the hardest part correctly and now needed a skill she did not have. She walked the 3 miles home in the dark, and for the first time in weeks, the math in her head included a variable that was not a subtraction. The roof edge remained open. The stovepipe clearance whistled in every gust. And the first real storm was building somewhere north of the Missouri, gathering itself in the way that plain storms gather, slowly, coldly, with the patience of something that has all winter to arrive. Ragna lay in the dark and listened to the 4 sealed walls holding against the wind, and she listened to the roof giving everything back, and she counted the days she had left the way. A gambler counts cards, knowing the numbers, not knowing the draw. 3 weeks, maybe less. A 61-year-old sailmaker with a cough, a boy with steady hands, a house half-armored against a winter that was coming whether the armor was finished or not. She closed her eyes. The stove ticked. The wind found the eaves and sang. Peter Flatin arrived at the shack the next morning, carrying a canvas roll under one arm and a toolbox under the other. The toolbox was old, scarred leather over a wooden frame, brass clasps green with age, and inside it were sail needles of 6 different gauges, a palm guard worn smooth as bone, a wooden fid for working grommets, an awl with a whalebone handle, a spool of waxed flax thread, and a folding knife with a blade so thin from years of sharpening that it flexed when pressed flat. These were the tools of a man who had spent 40 years making cloth hold against wind and water, and he set them on the plank table inside the shack, the way a surgeon sets instruments, each one placed with its purpose already in mind. He did not begin with the roof. He began with what Ragna had already done. He walked the 4 sealed walls slowly, pressing his palm against the canvas at every seam, every corner, every tack line. He crouched at the base of the north wall and ran his fingers along the bottom edge where the cloth met the ground timber. He stood on the scrap lumber ladder and examined the top edge of the south wall where the canvas ended and the exposed roof boards began. He took his time. Ragna watched without speaking, because she understood that he was reading the house the way her father had read a sail, not with his eyes but with his hands. When he finished, he came back inside and sat at the table and said 3 things. First, the walls were good. Better than good. The overlaps were correct, the tack spacing was sound on 3 of the 4 faces, and the tar penetration was deep enough to resist moisture for at least 2 seasons. She had done this part right. Second, the north wall tack spacing at the eave line was too wide. Every 4th tack needed a partner. Without it, the first sustained gust from the northwest would create enough lift to start peeling the top edge, and once the top edge lifted, the entire face would follow. He had seen this happen on ship covers in Bergen Harbor during autumn storms, a single loose inch becoming a catastrophic failure in minutes. Third, the roof was not a wall problem. It was an edge problem. The joint where wall canvas met roof board was the weakest point on the entire structure, and it could not be solved by tacking alone. It needed a cap strip, a continuous band of treated cloth that bridged the junction, sealed with pitch on both sides, lashed over a batten so the wind could not find a lip to catch. He could show her how, but she would need to do most of the work herself, because his chest did not allow him to spend hours on a ladder in cold wind. Ragna asked what she owed him. Peter looked at the stove, at the meager woodpile visible through the door, at Ivar sitting on the cot watching them with the quiet attention of a child who has learned that adult conversations decide whether he eats. He said, "I have been mending freight tarps for 6 years. A man can mend freight tarps until he dies and never make anything that matters. What you are building matters. That is what you owe me." The next 7 days were the most physically demanding of Ragna's life, and she had already been working at the edge of endurance for 2 weeks. Peter taught through demonstration. He did not lecture. He showed her once, watched her do it twice, corrected her hands, not her reasoning, and then stood back. His teaching had the precision of a man who had trained apprentices on ship rigging where a bad seam could kill, and he did not soften it for kindness. The first lesson was the cap strip. He cut a band of treated canvas 8 inches wide and showed her how to fold it lengthwise over a thin batten, a strip of wood no wider than a thumb, so that when tacked in place, the cloth draped over both sides of the wall-to-roof joint. The batten gave the strip rigidity at the ridgeline. The cloth sealed the gap on both faces. Pitch worked into the fold made the junction watertight and windtight in a single continuous run. The trick, Peter said, was tension. The strip had to be pulled tight enough to press flat against both surfaces, but not so tight that it tore at the tack points. He showed her how to anchor one end, walk the strip along the eave, and pull with steady, even force while Ivar drove tacks at 6-inch intervals behind her. The rhythm had to be constant. Stopped too long, and the cloth cooled and stiffened and fought the curve. Moved too fast, and the tacks missed the batten beneath. They sealed the south eave first. It took 4 hours. Ragna's shoulders burned from holding the strip overhead while Ivar hammered, and her fingers bled fresh where the cold cracked them open over the old cracks. Peter watched from below, coughing into his sleeve, calling corrections when the tension wandered. "Tighter," he said. "You are leaving a lip. Wind will find it." She pulled tighter. The seam lay flat. They moved to the west eave. The second lesson came the following day. The stovepipe clearance. This was the most dangerous point on the entire house, not because of wind, but because of fire. The iron pipe passing through the roof was hot when the stove was burning, and any cloth touching it would char and eventually ignite. Peter showed her how to cut a square collar from untreated canvas, mount it on a frame of scrap tin bent into a flange, and seal the gap between the flange and the treated roof cloth with a double layer of pitch applied cold. The cold pitch would not bond as strongly as hot, but it would not transfer heat to the cloth the way a hot application might. The collar stood clear of the pipe by 2 inches on every side, enough gap to prevent direct heat transfer, small enough to block driven snow and rain. "This is where most people die," Peter said. "Not from cold, from fixing cold badly. A stovepipe that leaks heat into cloth will burn the house down in an hour. Leave the gap, seal around it, never let the two touch. Ragna listened and watched his hands, and filed the knowledge in the same place she had filed her father's lesson 13 years ago. Except now there was no time to wait for the lesson to become urgent. It was urgent now. The third lesson was the most important and the simplest. Edges first, always. Peter said it once, and then he said it every day for the rest of the time they worked together. The middle of a wall or a roof does not fail. The edges fail. The corners fail. The transitions fail. Every joint, every terminus, every place where one material meets another, that is where the wind enters, where the water collects, where the strain concentrates. Seal the edges, and the middle takes care of itself. It was the philosophy of a lifetime spent working with cloth and weather, compressed into 3 words. Ragna heard it and understood it the way you understand a language you already half knew. On the 5th day of working together, they argued. Ragna wanted to double layer the north wall, a second skin of treated canvas over the first, with a trapped airspace between. Her reasoning was sound. 2 layers meant 2 barriers. Trapped air was a poor conductor. The north wall took the worst punishment. Peter shook his head. "You will trap moisture between the layers," he said. "Moisture freezes. Ice pushes tack points loose. By February, the inner layer separates and the airspace becomes a channel, and the wind moves through it faster than it would through a single wall." Ragna pushed back. Her father had used double layers on boat covers. It worked at sea. At sea, the covers dried between storms, Peter said. Here, the cold is continuous. What freezes in December does not thaw until April, one tight layer. That is enough. Do not get clever when correct is what you need. She did not like it. She accepted it. And later, when she saw ice crystals forming in the gap behind a loose corner where moisture had collected, she understood that Peter had been right, and that the difference between a good idea and a surviving idea was sometimes a single layer of cloth. Marta surprised everyone on the last afternoon of eve work. She arrived with her oldest boy and a pail of pitch she had heated at home, and she helped Ragna seal the final 3 feet of the west eave without explanation. When they finished, Marta pressed her hand to the sealed seam and held it there, and felt no air movement. Her expression did not change. She picked up her pail, collected her boy, and left. She still doubted the whole house, but one seam had convinced her hands, if not her mind, and that was a crack in certainty that winter would test. Meanwhile, Silas Bream had not been idle. Word came through the depot that he had bought up the last 3 loads of good coal before the first hard freeze, driving the price to $13 a ton for anyone who had not already contracted. 3 families who had been waiting for the price to drop found themselves paying more than they had budgeted, and 2 of them signed surety notes on their improvements to cover the difference. Silas was patient. Silas was building a winter portfolio of other people's failures, and Ragna's refusal to buy coal was not defiance to him. It was an invitation to wait. While they worked, winter advanced. The temperature dropped in steps. 5 degrees one night, steady for 2 days, then another 5. The mud around the house froze into permanent ridges. The creek south of the property skinned with ice that thickened daily. Frost formed inside the shack on every surface the stove did not directly warm, the north wall boards behind the canvas, the window glass, the bucket handle, the nails in the door frame. Ragna woke each morning to find Ivor's breath frozen in a faint rime on the blanket edge above his mouth. The woodpile shrank. She had cut another half cord during the construction weeks, working in the river breaks before dawn, and after the day's tacking was done, dragging timber back on the sled with Ivor pulling the rope beside her. The pile now stood at roughly 2.5 cords, better than the single cord Voss had dismissed, still less than half of what conventional wisdom demanded. If the house held its heat the way Ragna believed it would, 2.5 cords might be enough. If it did not, she was dead. Peter noticed the pile. He said nothing about it. Instead, one afternoon while they worked on the north eave, he told her something about Bergen winters. He said the fishing families who survived the longest were never the ones with the largest fuel stores. They were the ones whose houses were tightest. A tight house, he said, is a house that gives you time. A loose house takes time away from you. Every crack is a clock running faster. That single piece of understanding, time, not fuel, as the unit of survival, changed the way Ragna thought about the entire project. She was not building a warm house. She was building a slow house. A house that lost heat slowly enough for a small stove and a modest woodpile to keep pace with the loss. The stove did not need to win the fight against winter. It only needed to not lose faster than she could feed it. Harlan Voss came back on the third week. He rode up on the same dun gelding, and he sat in the saddle for a long minute looking at the black house before he dismounted. The canvas was complete on all 4 walls now. The eave strips were sealed. The stovepipe collar was in place. The south-facing surface was dark enough to absorb what thin winter sun reached it, and on a clear afternoon the cloth was perceptibly warm to the touch. The north wall was a continuous sheet of treated canvas, lapped and tacked so tightly that you could rap it with your knuckles and hear a drum sound. Voss walked the perimeter again. He pressed his palms to the north wall and held it there. He crouched at the base. He looked at the eave seals. "Drafts are cut," he said. "I will give you that." Ragna waited. "But drafts in October are not cold in January," Voss said. "You have 2.5 cords. That is not 6. When it drops below 0 and stays there for a week, your cloth will not make heat. It will only hold what the stove gives. And if the stove cannot give enough, you will freeze to death in a very tight box instead of a loose one." He mounted his horse. He looked down at her with an expression that was not contempt and not pity, but something between, the look of a man who had seen the plains take people who deserved better. "I hope you are right," he said. "I do not think you are. But I hope it." He rode away. Rana stood in the yard and felt the wind hit the north wall and slide off it like water off a tarred hull, and she did not know whether Voss was right or whether she was right, and neither did the viewer, and the only way to find out was to wait for January. The house was complete by the last week of November. Ragna made a final inspection with Peder beside her. He was coughing more frequently now, the sound deeper and wetter than it had been 2 weeks earlier, and he rested his hand on the south wall for balance more than once. But his eyes were still a sailmaker's eyes. They saw every tack, every seam, every place where cloth met wood and weather met shelter. The walls were sealed. The eave strips were continuous. The stovepipe clearance held its gap. The door had an inner curtain of treated canvas that Ragna dropped each time she entered or left, cutting the draft that an opening door would create. The single south window was sealed at its frame with pitch-soaked cloth strips, and the glass itself was backed with a second pane made from a piece of oiled sailcloth stretched on a frame, not transparent but translucent enough to pass light while blocking the air movement that single glass allowed. On a clear afternoon in the last days of November, Ragna sat inside with the door curtained down and the stove banked low and felt something she had not felt since arriving on the property. Stillness, not warmth. The house was not warm, but the air did not move. The wind outside was audible, but it was outside, pushing against a surface that did not yield. The stove's heat, small as it was, stayed in the room instead of streaming through 100 cracks into the sky. The frost on the interior north wall was thinner than it had been a month ago. The water pail had not frozen overnight. She did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet. October and November were not winter. They were the preamble. The real test was coming, and it would not be a clear afternoon with moderate wind. It would be January. It would be cold and wind arriving together, sustained for days, with no break and no mercy, and no room for a single failed seam. Marta came by on a Tuesday and stood inside the shack for 10 minutes without speaking. She touched the walls. She looked at the stove. She looked at the woodpile through the doorway. "You are burning less," Marta said. Ragna nodded. "A week is not a winter," Marta said. "I know," Ragna said. Marta left. Silas sent his boy past the property twice that week, and each time the boy slowed to look, and each time Ragna was outside working, banking snow against the lower walls for added insulation, sealing a tack that had loosened on the west face, trimming a seam strip that had curled at its edge. She worked on the house every day because the house was never finished. Edges first, always. Peter's voice in her head, edges first. December was a held breath. The cold settled over the valley in layers, each night colder than the last, each morning requiring more effort to start the day. Ragna rationed firewood with the precision of a woman counting coins. 1/4 cord per week was her target. At that rate, 2.5 cords would last 10 weeks, through the end of January if nothing went wrong. If a week of extreme cold forced her to burn more, the margin shrank. If the house leaked, the margin disappeared. The early data was promising. On mornings when the temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero, neighboring houses showed frost blooming thick on interior walls. Ragna's showed a thin film, easily wiped. The difference was not magic, it was air movement. In the neighbors' houses, cold air streamed through board joints and carried moisture that froze on every cold surface. In Ragna's house, the air was nearly still. What frost formed came from breathing and cooking, not from infiltration. Peter came by when he could. His cough worsened through December, and some days he did not come at all. When he did, he checked the eave seals and the stovepipe collar and the corner joints, running his hands over the work the way a man reads a letter in the dark. He said little. He coughed. He drank the coffee Ragna made, and sat by the stove and watched Ivor doing sums on a slate by lamplight. And something in his face softened in a way that Ragna recognized because she had seen it in her father's face, the look of a man watching knowledge pass forward. On Christmas Eve, Peter brought a jar of cloudberry preserves he had been saving and a piece of new wax thread for the sail needles. He told Ivor a story about a ship that survived a North Sea storm because its sails were patched so well that the patches held when the original cloth gave out. It was a story about preparation, and it was a story for a boy who was learning that preparation was not a word, but a practice. And Ivor listened the way children listen when they sense that the story is really about them. That night, Ragna lay in the dark and listened to the walls hold and the stove tick and the wind press against the blackened canvas and get nothing for its effort, and she allowed herself for one moment to think the word safe. She should not have. January came like a door slamming shut on a lit room. The temperature dropped 22 degrees in a single night during the first week. By dawn, the mercury in the depot thermometer stood at 26 below zero. The air was so cold that breathing through the nose burned the lining of the nostrils, and breathing through the mouth froze the moisture in the throat. The creek was locked solid. The ground was iron. The sky was the pale, empty blue that means no cloud cover and no insulation from space, and the cold poured down from it like something with weight. And then the wind came. It started from the northwest on the second night, not a gust, but a sustained wall of moving air that drove powder snow horizontal across the valley floor. The snow was dry as sand and fine as flour, and it found every crack in every structure it touched. Board walls that had been tight enough in December suddenly showed seams of white where the driven powder forced itself through joints no wider than a knife blade. The wind did not stop. It built. Inside the black house, Ragna heard the canvas respond. The north wall bellied inward under the pressure, then snapped tight as the gusts pulsed, a drumming rhythm she could feel in her chest. The tack lines held. The eave seals held. The corner joints held. But the sound was the sound of something being tested at the limit of its design. And every snap was a question with a one-word answer she did not yet have. Ivor woke with a fever on the third morning. His skin was hot and dry, and his eyes were glassy, and his breath came fast and shallow, in the way that meant his chest was tightening. Ragna pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the heat of a body fighting something it could not name, and the fear that arrived was different from the fear of cold or wind or money. This was the fear of a child sick in a place where the nearest doctor was in Dickinson, 40 miles east on roads that were now impassable. She could not leave him. She could not take him outside. The temperature was 28 below zero, and the wind was driving powder so thick that the depot across the valley was invisible. She banked the stove hotter than her ration allowed, a half-day's wood in a single feeding, and hung a blanket over Ivor's cot to trap the warmth close to his body. And she brewed willow bark tea from a store she had bought in October and held the cup to his mouth while his teeth chattered against the rim. The stove gulped the extra fuel, and the temperature inside climbed to something almost comfortable, and the sealed walls held that comfort in a way that bare boards never could have. She could feel the house working. The heat stayed. The air did not move. The cloth on the walls was doing exactly what her father had said it would do, stopping the wind, changing the problem from impossible to difficult. But the roof edge seam on the lee side chose that night to fail. The wind had shifted. A gust from the northeast, unusual, violent, angled against the face of the house that had been sheltered, caught the eave strip on the southeast corner and lifted it. The strip did not tear. It peeled. One tack pulled free, then another, and the canvas curled upward like a lip, and the wind found the gap and entered the roof joint with a sound like a long, low whistle that cut through every other noise in the house. Ragna heard it and knew what it meant. Peder's voice was in her head before the sound had faded. One corner is all it takes. She had minutes. If the strip continued to peel, the wind would get under the roof edge and work its way along the eave, and the entire south face seal would fail, and she would be back to heating the sky through a sieve, except now it was 28 below, and she had a sick child and less wood than she started with. She put on every piece of clothing she owned. She told Ivor to stay under the blankets and not to move. She took the hammer, a handful of tacks, a scrap of treated canvas, and 2 strips of batten from the pile by the door. She dropped the door curtain behind her and stepped into the wind. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The air was moving so fast that the powder snow stung exposed skin like thrown grit. She could not see the depot. She could not see the neighboring cabins. She could see her own north wall, black canvas drumming in the gusts, and the southeast corner where the eave strip had lifted. She climbed the ladder. The rungs were coated in ice, and her gloves were stiff with frozen tar from weeks of work. And she gripped each rung with her full hand and pulled herself up the way she had pulled herself through every day since August, not with confidence but with refusal. Refusal to stop. Refusal to let the wind take what her hands had built. At the eave line, she could see the damage. 3 tacks had pulled free. The strip had peeled back 18 inches, curling upward in the wind, and the gap between the wall canvas and the roof boards was open to the storm. Snow was already building in the gap. She could feel the air pouring through it, a focused stream of cold entering the house through a wound no wider than a hand. If you are still here, if you need to know whether this house holds, Then you understand what keeps a person watching. Stay with us. What happens in the next 3 minutes changes everything. She worked from memory and from Pater's voice. Cloth fails progressively, not all at once, if strain is redirected. She did not try to retack the peeled strip. She laid the scrap canvas over the gap, overlapping the torn section by 6 inches on each side. She pressed the batten over the new cloth to give the tacks something to grip besides fabric alone. And she drove the tacks through the batten, through the new canvas, through the old strip, and into the roof board beneath. 6 tacks in a line, as fast as she could swing the hammer with frozen hands. The wind fought her. It caught the loose edge of the scrap and tried to tear it from her grip. She held it with her left hand and drove tacks with her right, and her fingers were so cold she could not feel the tack heads, only the impact of the hammer through the bones of her hand. One tack bent. She pulled it with the claw and drove another. The strip held. The gap closed. The whistle inside the house went silent. She climbed down the ladder and fell the last 2 rungs because her legs had stopped cooperating, and she lay on the frozen ground for 10 seconds with the wind screaming over her and the black wall of her house standing above her like something that had decided to live. She went inside. She dropped the door curtain. The wind noise dropped by half. She stood dripping meltwater on the plank floor, her coat crusted with ice, her hands shaking so violently she could not close them into fists. She fed the stove. She checked Ivor. His fever was high, but he was breathing, and his eyes tracked her movement across the room. "Mama," he said. He had not called her that in months. He was 11. He was scared. "The house is holding," she said. "We are holding." That night was the worst. The temperature dropped again after midnight. How far below 0 she could not know because she had no thermometer. But the stove tin hissed when she touched it with a wet finger, and the air coming off the north wall felt like it came from stone buried underground. She sat up through the dark hours, feeding the stove at intervals she measured by the burn rate of the wood. A split piece of pine lasted 40 minutes. A cottonwood piece lasted 25. She counted the pieces beside the stove. 7 left for the night. She calculated. She fed the fire at the minimum rate that kept the iron warm enough to radiate, and she hugged her coat around her shoulders and watched the shadows move on the canvas walls and listened. The canvas talked all night. It popped and groaned and drummed. The tack lines creaked. The eave strips hummed a low note when the gusts peaked. Every sound was a question. Every silence between gusts was a held breath. She found herself counting seconds between the loudest impacts, the way a person counts between thunder and lightning, measuring how close the storm's worst was, waiting for the interval to lengthen, waiting for the sign that the peak had passed. Sometime before dawn, the stovepipe backdrafted. A gust from the northwest hit the chimney cap at an angle that reversed the draw, and smoke billowed back into the room in a thick gray cloud that burned her eyes and sent Ivor into a coughing fit that sounded like it would tear his chest apart. Ragna grabbed the stove door and shut it. The room went dark except for the glow through the firebox seams. The smoke hung at ceiling level and settled slowly. She opened the stove door a crack and held a scrap of cloth near the pipe joint to feel the draw. Upward. The gust had passed. The draw was restored. She opened the door fully, and the fire recovered and the smoke thinned, but her lungs ached, and Ivor's coughing continued for 10 minutes, and she held him upright with one hand and pressed a damp cloth to his face with the other, and waited for the spasm to pass. It passed. She laid him back down. She fed the stove its 3rd piece of pine, and checked the door curtain, and found that the smoke had deposited a fine layer of soot on the inner canvas walls. And for a moment she almost laughed because the soot was doing what she had done deliberately on the outside, darkening the surface. though here it served no purpose but to record how close the night had come. The storm continued for 2 more days. On the second day, the wind gusted hard enough to drive a fence post flat in the neighboring pasture. The temperature reached 31 below zero before dawn. At Harlan Voss's place, a mile and a half north, the board walls leaked air through every joint despite battens and caulking applied in September. Voss burned through a quarter cord of split oak in a single night, trying to keep the interior livable. His wife slept in her coat. His cattle huddled against the windbreak he had built, and 2 calves died in the drifts. At Marta Kroll's place, the children slept in a pile on the floor nearest the stove, wrapped in every blanket the house owned. Marta's husband fed the fire through the night in shifts, burning cottonwood that hissed with moisture and threw half its heat up the chimney. The frost on their interior walls was a 1/4 inch thick by morning. The water pail froze solid. Marta boiled snow for drinking and for washing, and the effort of maintaining liquid water consumed wood she could not spare. At Silas Bream's yard, the coal shed was full. He had plenty, but the drifts choked the road so completely that no delivery wagon could move, and 3 families who had bought coal on credit could not reach his yard to collect what they had already paid for. They burned what they had, and then they burned furniture, and then they burned fence rails, and when the fence rails were gone, they burned nothing and prayed. Down the valley, an old bachelor homesteader named Tolef Asen was found the morning after the worst night by a rider who had come to check on him. Tolef was sitting in a chair beside a cold stove with a blanket over his shoulders and frost in his beard. He was not dead. He was close. His board cabin had no battens left on the north wall. They had blown free in November, and he had not replaced them. The wind had entered his house like a river and taken everything the stove offered and then taken his warmth as well. The rider hauled him out on a sled and brought him to a neighbor's house, and Tolef lived, but he lost 3 toes on his left foot and the hearing in one ear, and he never spent another winter in the territory. Inside the black house, Ragna kept the stove fed at her rationed pace, a 1/4 cord per week. She did not feed it more because she did not need to. The walls held. The repaired eave seal held. The door curtain held. The air inside was cold. She could see her breath, but it was still. The heat from the stove stayed in the room and radiated from the walls and rose to the roof and came back down instead of streaming through 1,000 cracks into the killing wind. She melted snow for water and brewed willow tea for Ivor, and kept the blanket tent over his cot, and waited. His fever broke on the second evening. He asked for food. She gave him salt pork broth and a piece of biscuit, and he ate both and slept, and his breathing was even and deep, and the stove ticked, and the wind pushed, and the walls pushed back, and the night passed. By the 3rd morning, the wind had dropped. The temperature climbed to 4 below zero, which felt tropical after 31 below. The sun came up over a valley that looked like the aftermath of a siege, drifts piled against every structure, fence posts buried, stock scattered or dead, roads erased. Ragna stepped outside and looked at her house. The black canvas was dusted with powder snow on the north and west faces, but it had not torn, had not peeled, had not failed. The repair she had made on the ladder in the dark held cleanly. The tack lines were intact. The corners were tight. The eave strips were flat. The house was ugly and dark and conspicuous against the white landscape, and it was standing, and she was alive inside it, and her brother was alive inside it, and the wood pile behind the east wall still held wood. She walked to the pile and counted. She had burned through roughly 1/3 of a cord during the 3 worst days. More than her 1/4 cord weekly ration, less than half of what Voss had burned in a single night in a house 3 times the size. The math was simple. At this rate, she had fuel for another 6 weeks. She would reach March. She would reach spring. She stood in the brittle light and looked at the valley, and she did not feel triumph. Triumph is what people feel who have won. She felt something quieter and harder, the knowledge that the method worked, that the house held, and that the worst had come, and she had answered it with cloth and tar and tacks and her father's voice, and Pater's hands, and a boy who held canvas in the wind until his fingers went white. That was not triumph. That was proof. The first person to come was not a neighbor. It was Harlan Voss. He arrived on the fourth morning after the storm, when the roads were still choked with drifts but passable on horseback if you knew where the fence lines ran beneath the snow. He did not knock. He tied his horse and walked the perimeter of the black house the way he had walked it in October, pressing his palm to the walls, crouching at the base, checking the eave seals, examining the patch Ragna had made on the southeast corner during the worst of the wind. He took his time. He did not speak. Ragna watched from the doorway. Ivar stood behind her, pale from the fever, but upright, his hand resting on the door frame. Voss finished his inspection and stood in the yard looking at the wood pile. He looked at it for a long time. Then he walked to it and pulled back the canvas cover Ragna had draped over the top to keep snow off the dry wood. And he counted. He counted the way a stockman counts cattle, quickly, accurately, without needing to touch. He turned to Ragna. "How much did you burn?" he said. She told him. Roughly a third of a cord during the 3 worst days, more than her weekly ration, less than what she had feared. Voss looked at the pile again. He looked at the house. He looked at the north wall, where the canvas was dusted with powder snow but unbroken, the tack lines holding, the eave strip flat and sealed. "I burned nearly a full cord in a single night," he said. His voice was quiet. Not ashamed, Voss was not a man who felt shame easily, but something close to it, something that cost him. "My walls are twice as thick as yours. I have battens and caulking and a stove that draws better than any in the valley. And I burned 4 times what you burned because every joint in my house gave the heat back to the wind as fast as the iron could make it." He paused. He looked at Ragna the way a man looks at something he has to recalculate. "I was measuring fuel," he said. "You were measuring wind." He did not apologize for what he had said in October. He did not need to. The sentence itself was the apology, the admission that he had been solving the wrong problem, and that a 24-year-old woman with a dead husband and $18 had seen the right one before he had. He asked how the eave seals were constructed. Ragna showed him. She walked him to the north wall and pointed out the cap strip, the continuous band of treated canvas bridging the wall-to-roof joint, folded over a batten, tacked at 6-inch intervals. She showed him the corner wraps where wall met wall, the pitch-sealed fold that made each transition airtight. She showed him the door curtain and the window seal and the stovepipe collar with its 2-inch clearance gap. Voss examined each detail with the thoroughness of a man who builds for a living. He crouched at the corner wraps and tested the tension with his thumbnail. He stood on the ladder, the same scrap lumber ladder Ragna had climbed in the storm, and ran his palm along the eave strip until he reached the patch she had made during the worst night. "This held," he said. He was not asking. "It held," Ragna said. He climbed down. He stood in the yard and looked at the house as though seeing it for the first time, and in a sense he was. In October he had seen a doomed shack wrapped in cloth by a desperate woman. Now he was seeing a structure that had outperformed his own. He asked about the tar and oil mixture. She told him the ratio and the method: pine tar thinned with linseed oil, heated to the consistency of dark honey, worked into the canvas weave while warm. He asked how she had known the ratio. She told him about her father, about the sail loft in Haugesund, about the lesson she had carried for 13 years without knowing she would need it. Voss listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said a thing that surprised her. He said, "I have been building on this plane for 19 years, Every year I build thicker walls and cut more fuel and fight the same fight, and every year the cold wins by the same margin. It never occurred to me that the fight itself was wrong, that the answer was not more resistance but less leakage. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. A man gets used to solving the problem he knows how to solve, he said, even when it is the wrong problem. Ragnar answered every question he had, because knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted, and because Voss had been wrong, but he had not been cruel, and because the next storm would not care who had been right if the valley was not ready. Voss rode away with a list in his head and a look on his face that Ragnar recognized. It was the look of a man who had just learned something that changed the shape of what he thought he knew. Marta came the next day. She did not bring bread this time. She brought questions. She stood in Ragnar's kitchen and looked at the walls and the stove and the thin layer of soot from the backdraft and the door curtain and the window seal, and she asked questions with the focused intensity of a woman who had spent 3 nights watching her children sleep in their coats and had decided that she would never watch that again. She started with the walls. She pressed her palms flat against the south face and closed her eyes and held still. She was feeling for what was not there, the tiny currents of cold air that moved through every board wall house she had ever lived in, the constant invisible rivers of infiltration that she had accepted as the nature of winter shelter. They were absent. The wall was cold. Canvas over boards over winter air would always be cold, but the cold was still. It sat against her palms like something solid. Nothing moved. She opened her eyes, and the expression on her face was one Ragnar recognized, the look of a person whose body has just told their mind something their mind did not want to hear. "How do you seal the corners?" she said. Ragnar showed her. Treated canvas strips folded into the gap between walls, tacked on both faces, pitch pressed into the fold. Simple, effective. The key was continuity. No break in the seal from ground timber to eave. Marta touched the corner joint with both hands. She pressed her cheek against it. She closed her eyes again and felt for air movement. "Nothing," she said. "Not a breath." She pulled back and looked around the room, at the stove that was banked low, but keeping the space livable, at the water pail that was not frozen, at Ivor sitting on his cot reading a book he had borrowed from the station agent's wife. The room was not warm. It was functional. It was a room where a child could read a book instead of huddle under blankets. And for Marta, who had spent January watching her own children shiver, that distinction meant everything. "I do not want a black house," Marta said. Her voice was careful, the voice of a woman preserving her dignity while changing her position. "My husband would not allow it. But the north wall, the seams, the corner strips. If you showed me how to treat the cloth and seal the worst points, I could do the north face and the door by next week." Ragnar said, "Bring your cloth tomorrow. Bring your pitch. I will show you." Marta nodded once. She left without saying thank you, which was its own form of respect, the acknowledgement that what Ragnar offered was not a favor, but a trade of knowledge between equals. Others followed. Not a flood. The valley was small, and pride moved slowly, and many families had their own methods and their own stubbornness. But in the week after the January storm, 3 more settlers came to Ragnar's door. The first was a widow named Birgit Haugen, 60 years old, living alone in a 2-room cabin with board walls that had leaked so badly during the storm she had moved her bed into the root cellar for warmth. She wanted to seal her north wall. Ragnar walked to her cabin with treated cloth strips and showed her how to apply them at the joints, not a full wall skin, just the critical seams where air entered fastest. The work took half a day. That night, Birgit's stove held its heat 2 hours longer than it had before, and the frost on her interior wall thinned from a crust to a film. The second was a young stockman named Arne Tveit, 29, who had lost 2 calves in the storm and blamed the windbreak he had built from loose boards. Ragna showed him how to stretch treated canvas over the windward face of the fence structure, creating a surface the wind could not penetrate. The calves that survived huddled against it during the next cold snap and came through without loss. The third was a freight driver who wanted to know if the treatment would work on wagon covers for winter hauling. Ragna told him it would, and she told him the mixture and the method, and he paid her $2 for the information because he was a man who understood that knowledge earned through suffering had a price. $2. It was not much. It was the first money Ragna had earned since arriving on the claim, and she put it in the tin box under the floorboard where the remaining coins lived, and the box felt heavier than $2 should have made it feel. Silas Brame did not come to learn. He came to the general store, where 3 men were discussing the black house and the woman who had built it, and he stood at the counter and listened with the patience of a man who understands that reputation is a form of currency he can spend or destroy. "That cloth will not last a second winter," he said. "Tar rots. Oil dries. By August, she will be back to bare boards and no money to replace them, and then she will be in my store asking for coal on the same terms she refused in October." The men listened because Silas controlled the fuel supply and because men who owe money to a creditor listen when the creditor speaks. But one of them, a rancher named Knut Espeland, who had seen his own cabin's walls leak during the storm, said a thing that made Silas's jaw tighten. "My walls leaked and hers did not," Knut said. "I do not care whether the cloth lasts 1 winter or 10. It lasted this one." Silas left the store. He did not slam the door because men like Silas do not slam doors. They close them quietly and remember who said what. The campaign shifted. Silas stopped mocking the method and started questioning the woman. He mentioned Ragna's debts, the hardware bill her dead husband had left, the unpaid balance on the shack purchase. He mentioned that a claim required continuous residence and improvement, and that a woman alone with a child might find the proving up requirements difficult to meet. He did not make threats. He planted seeds, and seeds in a small community grow whether you water them or not. Ragna heard the talk. She heard it from the station agent and from Birgit Haugen and from Marta, who told her bluntly, "Silas wants your claim. He has wanted it since October. The house surviving the storm has not changed his want. It has made it more urgent because now the claim is worth more." Ragna absorbed this the way she absorbed weather, as a fact to be measured and prepared for, not argued with. Peter Flatten was dying, though neither of them said the word. His cough had deepened through January into something that sounded like it came from below the lungs, from a place where the body stores damage it cannot repair. He came to the shack less frequently. When he came, he sat by the stove and drank coffee and talked, and the talking was different now, not instruction, but conversation, the kind that happens between people who have built something together and know that the building is almost finished. But he still worked. On the days when his chest allowed it, he and Ragna built together. Their first project after the storm was a canvas vestibule for Ragna's door, a small enclosed space, 3 feet deep, framed with scrap lumber and wrapped in treated canvas on all sides that created an airlock between the outside and the interior. You entered the vestibule, closed the outer flap behind you, then opened the inner door. The stove never felt the wind of an opening. The idea was Peter's. The construction was shared. He cut the frame joints with the precision of a man who had built boat fittings for 40 years, and Ragna stretched and tacked the canvas over the frame, and Ivar held the pieces while they worked, and the vestibule went up in a single afternoon. It was a small thing. It saved perhaps a cord of wood over a winter. But building it together, Peter's hands on the frame, Ragna's hands on the cloth, the rhythm of shared labor where each person knows what the other will do before they do it. That was not small. That was the fullest expression of what a mentor and a student become when the teaching is finished and the partnership begins. He told her about Bergen, about the harbor in winter when the North Sea threw weather against the breakwater and the fishing boats came in crusted with ice, and the sailmakers worked through the night replacing canvas that the storm had shredded. He told her about a captain who had refused to pay for proper tarring on his mainsail because he thought the old treatment would last one more season. The sail tore in a gale off Utsira, and the boat drifted for 2 days before another vessel found it. The captain survived. 2 crew did not. The captain came back to the sail loft and paid for the tarring, and Peter made the sail, and he said to Ragna, "A man who saves money on edges pays for it in the middle." He told her about the woman who had married the ship's captain instead because a sailmaker's hands were rough and a sailmaker's income was uncertain, and how he had come west not for opportunity but for distance. The specific distance required to stop thinking about a woman in a white house above the harbor. 40 years, he said. He could still see the house when he closed his eyes. Ragna listened. She mended cloth while he talked, and Ivar did his sums on the slate, and the stove ticked, and the wind pressed against the walls and got nothing for its trouble, and the room held 3 people in a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Their last project together was a windbreak screen for the woodpile. Peter designed it, a simple A-frame of scrap timber with treated canvas stretched over the windward face, and they built it on a February afternoon when the sun was bright and the temperature hovered near 0 and the light caught the black walls of the house and warmed them just enough that you could feel it through your gloves. Peter worked slowly. He coughed between cuts. He sat on the chopping block twice and rested his hands on his knees and breathed carefully, rationing air the way Ragna rationed fuel. But he finished his side of the frame, and he drove the last tack with a steady hand, and he stood back and looked at the screen and nodded. "Edges first," he said, "even on a woodpile." 3 days later, on a Tuesday in early February, Peter brought his toolbox to the shack and set it on the table. The sail needles, the palm guard, the awl with the whalebone handle, the waxed thread, the folding knife. He pushed the box toward Ragna. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I cannot use these where I am going," Peter said. "And they should not sit in a depot shed while someone who knows what they are for is sealing houses with a hammer and tacks." Peter. He held up a hand. "Edges first," he said. "Always. You know the rest." He left that afternoon. He walked back to the depot with his coat buttoned and his scarf over his mouth and his cough trailing behind him in the cold air like something trying to keep up. Ragna stood in the doorway and watched him go, and she held the toolbox against her chest, and the leather was warm from the stove, and the brass clasps were cold from his hands, and she understood that he had given her the last thing he had that mattered. Peter Flatten died in his room above the depot on the 19th of February, 1887. The station agent found him in his chair with a coffee cup on the table beside him, still half full. He was buried in the small cemetery east of town, and Ragna and Ivar stood at the grave in wind that cut through every layer of clothing, and Ivar held the awl in his coat pocket because Ragna had told him that a craftsman's tools should be present when the craftsman is remembered. There is a kind of silence that follows the loss of someone who taught you how to survive. It is not grief exactly, or not only grief. It is the awareness that every skill your hands now hold was passed from hands that are still. That the voice you hear when you check a seam or test a joint is speaking from a place you cannot reach. Ragna carried that silence for the rest of the winter, and it did not weigh her down. It steadied her, the way ballast steadies a ship, weight in the right place, doing its work without being seen. The secondary crisis arrived in the first week of March. when winter should have been loosening its grip but was not. A late cold snap hit the valley, not as severe as January, but bitter enough after weeks of gradual warming that it caught people off guard. The ground had begun to soften in the top inch. Water appeared in wheel ruts. 2 days of thin sunshine convinced the optimists that the worst was past. Then the sky closed like a fist, and the temperature dropped to 14 below zero overnight, and the meltwater froze into a skin of ice over everything it had touched, and the wind came back from the northwest with the lazy cruelty of something that had never actually left. At Marta Kroll's cabin, the stovepipe cracked. The crack was small, a line no wider than a hair, running along a seam in the iron where the metal had expanded and contracted through 4 months of heating and cooling. Small enough that Marta's husband did not notice it at first. What he noticed was the smell, a sharpening of the usual wood smoke scent into something acrid, something that burned the back of the throat. By the time he traced it to the pipe, smoke was leaking into the main room in a thin blue haze that thickened as the fire burned. He tried to seal it with clay scraped from the floor. The heat dried the clay in minutes and it fell away in flakes. He tried wet rags wrapped around the pipe. They steamed, smoked, and added their own fumes to the air. He tried banking the fire, but the room temperature dropped so fast with the stove damped that the youngest child began to shiver in her blankets within 20 minutes. The house was a board cabin with no canvas treatment, no sealed seams, no airtight walls. Without the stove running at full, the cold entered from every direction. They had 3 children under 8. They could not stay inside with the stove burning. They could not stop burning the stove without freezing. They were trapped between smoke and cold, and neither option ended well. Marta's husband carried the children outside one by one and settled them in the livestock shed, wrapped in every blanket the house owned, pressed between the 2 milk cows for body heat. The children cried. The youngest, a girl of 3, cried until she stopped, which was worse because a child who stops crying in the cold is a child who is going somewhere no parent can follow. Marta's oldest boy, 8 years old, said he would run for help. His mother told him no. The boy said the black house was only 2 miles. His mother looked at the smoke pouring from the cabin door and at her husband's face and at the 3-year-old who had stopped crying, and she said, "Go." The boy ran 2 miles across frozen ground with no lamp and no coat heavy enough for 14 below. He fell twice on the ice and got up both times and kept running. He arrived pounding on Ragna's door at 1 in the morning, his face white with cold, his words tumbling out faster than his breath could carry them. Ragna dressed in 2 minutes. She took Peter's toolbox, a roll of treated canvas, a tin of pitch, and a length of wire. She told Ivar to stay in the house and keep the stove fed, and not to open the door until she returned. She followed the boy back across the dark valley with the wind in her face and the cold pressing through her coat like water through cloth. At Marta's cabin, the smoke was thick enough to taste from the dooryard. Marta's husband had the children in the shed. Marta stood by the cabin door holding a wet rag over her mouth, and when she saw Ragna arrive in the dark with the toolbox under her arm, something in her face broke open, not relief exactly, but the surrender of a woman who had spent 4 months doubting and now needed to believe. Ragna did not speak to her. She went inside. The smoke was blinding. She dropped to her knees where the air was clearer and crawled to the stove. She found the pipe crack by feel, running her gloved hand along the iron until she felt the leak, a thin jet of hot gas pushing against her palm like a whisper with teeth. She wrapped the wire around the cracked section 3 times, tight, compressing the seam. Then she cut a strip of treated canvas from the roll, wrapped it over the wire, and secured it with more wire twisted tight with fence pliers. The canvas would char against the hot iron eventually. It did not need to last forever. It needed to last until morning, when the pipe could be replaced or properly patched with sheet iron. She opened the door and the single window to clear the worst of the smoke. The cold rushed in, and the room temperature dropped 20 degrees in a minute. She waited until she could see the far wall, then sealed the door and window again and banked the stove lower. Less heat, less pressure through the crack, less smoke. The wire and canvas patch held. A faint haze drifted from the repair, but the room was breathable. Marta brought the children back inside one at a time. The 3-year-old had started crying again, which meant she was warming, which meant she was going to be all right. Marta put them to bed nearest the stove in a pile of blankets and bodies, and her husband stood by the door looking at Rana with the expression of a man recalculating the value of a person he had underestimated. Rana stayed until dawn. She checked the patch every hour, pressing her hand near the repair to feel for increased leakage. She fed the stove at the minimum rate, enough to keep the room above freezing, not enough to stress the cracked pipe further. She showed Marta how to monitor the repair and when to dampen the fire if the smoke increased. She showed her where to feel for the telltale warmth of expanding gas, and how to tighten the wire with pliers if the compression loosened. When the light came, Ragna walked the 2 miles home in the cold, and her hands were steady, and her chest hurt from the smoke, and her legs were heavy with exhaustion, but her mind was clear. She had done what Peter would have done. She had fixed an edge. She had bought time. She had used his tools and his thinking and his voice in her head saying, "Tighter, tighter, do not leave a lip," and she had kept a family alive through a night that could have killed them. Peter's needles were in the toolbox. His awl was in Ever's pocket. His knowledge was in her hands, working in the dark on someone else's house, and that was the only kind of immortality a craftsman gets. If this story reminds you that what we learn from others outlives both the teacher and the lesson, share it with someone who taught you something that mattered. They might not know what it meant to you. After the stovepipe night, the valley's attitude shifted in ways that were subtle but measurable. Marta became Ragna's most active student. She sealed her own north wall and door frame with treated canvas strips within a week, working from the methods Ragna had taught her and asking questions when the work demanded judgment she had not yet developed. Her husband, who had resisted the black cloth method as unsightly and impractical, said nothing while his wife worked. His silence was its own conversion, the quiet surrender of a man who had watched his children shiver for 3 months and was no longer willing to argue about aesthetics. 3 more families came to Ragna for advice during March. One wanted a root cellar roof sealed against snow melt. One wanted a bunkhouse door fitted with a canvas curtain and frame. One wanted a freight shed wrapped on the windward face. Ragna helped each one, sometimes walking to the property, sometimes explaining the method at her own table with scraps of canvas and a tin of pitch as demonstration tools. She did not charge for the teaching. She charged for the materials when she supplied them, and she accepted trade, eggs, flour, a sack of dried beans, half a smoked ham, when cash was scarce. The economy of knowledge was different from the economy of coal. Coal burned and was gone. Knowledge spread and multiplied. Every sealed wall in the valley was a wall that needed less fuel, and every family that needed less fuel was a family less dependent on Silas Brame's credit terms. Silas understood this, and it frightened him more than the storm had. His business depended on necessity. Ragna was making necessity smaller. His latest move was quieter and more dangerous than mockery. He visited the county office in Dickinson and inquired about Ragna's claim, whether her residency was continuous, whether her improvements met the proving up standard, whether a single woman with no husband and no visible income could satisfy the requirements. He asked specific questions about the $47 improvement and whether a structure wrapped in cloth constituted a permanent dwelling. The clerk, to his credit, told Silas that the Homestead Act did not require a husband, that cloth over boards was still a board structure, and that improvements were assessed by inspection, not by a coal merchant's opinion. Silas left the office with nothing he could use immediately, but the inquiry itself was a signal, a reminder that the law was not the only thing that determined who held land in Dakota Territory. Money was. Persistence was. And Silas had both. He also began talking to the remaining debtor families, the ones who had signed surety notes on their improvements to cover coal costs. He reminded them casually that their notes came due in April. He reminded them that he had been patient. He reminded them that patience was a choice, not a guarantee. The message was clear without being stated. If Ragna's method spread too far, if fuel demand dropped, if his leverage weakened, then the existing notes would need to be called in sooner. The families who owed him were now, in effect, hostages against the Valley's adoption of Ragna's technique. Every house that sealed its seams was a house that threatened to make Silas's investment worthless, and every family that owed Silas money was a family that might pressure Ragna to stop teaching. Ragna heard about the inquiry from the station agent, who heard it from the mail carrier, who heard it from the clerk's wife. She heard about the pressure on the debtor families from Birgit Haugen, whose neighbor was one of them. She filed it all where she filed all threats, in the part of her mind that planned for weather. Silas was a storm. He operated by the same principles as winter: sustained pressure, exploitation of weakness, patience that outlasted resistance. The difference was that Silas could be outlasted in return. Winter always ended. So would he. Spring came the way it always comes to the northern plains, not as a season, but as a negotiation. Warm days followed by cold nights. Meltwater in the afternoon, ice by morning. The snow retreated in patches, revealing the brown grass beneath like skin under a bandage. The creek unlocked itself in stages, first a trickle under the ice, then a rush that carried winter's debris south toward the river. And the valley emerged from 3 months of siege looking thinner, quieter, and altered in ways that would not be fully visible until the next fall. Ragna's shack stood in the spring mud with its black canvas walls darkened further by winter, tar and soot, and weather had deepened the color until the house looked like something grown from the ground rather than built on top of it. The canvas had held. Not perfectly, 2 tack lines on the west wall needed resetting where thermal cycling had worked the nails loose, and the stovepipe collar showed charring where the inner canvas ring had gotten closer to the iron than Pater's 2-inch rule allowed. But the structure was intact. The seams were sealed. The house had kept its promise through the worst winter in memory, and the woodpile behind the east wall still held wood that would not need to be burned. She spent April repairing, replacing, and improving. She pulled the south wall canvas where the sun had dried the tar treatment thinnest and recoated it with fresh mixture, working it in with the flat stick and rag the way she had done in October, except now her hands knew the rhythm without thinking. She replaced the stovepipe collar with a new one built to Pader's specifications, but with her own modification, a double flange that held the clearance gap at 2.5 inches instead of 2, giving more margin against pipe expansion. She stitched new seam strips using Pader's sail needles, and the stitching was cleaner than her first attempts because the needles were better tools and because her hands had 6 months of practice that her October hands had not. Ever helped. He was 12 now. His birthday had passed in February without celebration because Pater's death was too recent and celebration felt wrong. And the winter had changed him in ways that went beyond height and weight. He could mix the tar and oil treatment to the right consistency by eye. He could drive tacks in a straight line at even spacing without marking the intervals first. He could read a seam with his fingertips and tell Ragna whether the tension was right or whether it needed pulling tighter. He was becoming, in small and specific ways, the next link in the chain that ran from Holvor Lunde's sail loft to Peter Flatten's depot, shed, to a black house on a flat south of Medora. Through the spring, Ragna refined the method. She experimented with lighter canvas sections for summer, removable panels on the south and east walls that could be taken down when ventilation mattered more than insulation, then rehung in September when the nights turned. The panels used a hook and grommet system she designed from Pater's Sale hardware, quick to attach and remove, stored flat under the eaves when not in use. It was a small innovation built on top of the larger one, and it mattered because it answered the most common objection she heard from families who were interested but wary. What about summer? A house sealed tight for winter would be stifling in July. The removable panels solved it. She developed a cheaper version of the seam strip method for families who could not afford full wall skins. Treated cloth strips applied only at the board joints, every crack sealed, every gap covered, cost a fraction of whole wall coverage and captured most of the benefit. A family with $2 for canvas and 50 cents for tar and oil could seal a north wall in a day and cut their fuel consumption by a measurable amount. It was not the full system. It was the minimum effective dose, and it spread faster than the full system because it asked less of people who had little to give. She taught, not in a classroom. There were no classrooms, but at kitchen tables and on building sites, and in her own yard where the treated canvas hung on the frames and the tar kettles sat cold beside the chopping block. She taught Marta's husband, who had resisted learning from a woman until the stovepipe night made his resistance look foolish. He stood in Ragna's yard on a March afternoon and watched her demonstrate the seam strip method, and when she handed him the brush and the tar and told him to try, his first stroke was stiff and uneven, and the tar pooled at the edges. By his fourth strip, he had found the rhythm. By his 10th, he was working without looking up. Ragna said nothing because the best teaching ends in silence, the silence of a student who no longer needs to be told. She taught Birgit Haugen's nephew, a 17-year-old named Embret who wanted to build his own claim cabin and wanted it tight from the start. He was impatient the way young men are impatient, and he wanted to skip the seam strips and go straight to full wall coverage. Ragna made him seal an entire north wall with strips first. When he finished, she made him press his hand against every joint and feel for leakage. He found 3 gaps where his overlap was too narrow, or his tack spacing too wide. She did not point them out. She made him find them. He found them, and he fixed them. And when he built his cabin the following spring, it was the tightest new structure in the valley, and he told people that Ragna Lunde had taught him, and the way he said it carried the weight of a credential. She taught the wife of a railroad section hand who lived in a company shack worse than Ragna's original thinner boards, wider gaps, a stovepipe that drew so poorly the family kept the door cracked even in winter to prevent backdraft. The woman could not afford full canvas treatment. She could afford 2 yards of treated cloth and an afternoon. Ragna showed her how to seal the 4 worst joints on the north wall and how to build a canvas curtain for the door, and the woman went home and did the work herself, and her children slept that night without wearing their coats for the first time since November. Each person she taught went home and sealed their own walls, and each sealed wall was a wall that survived the next cold snap better than it had survived the last one, and each family that burned less fuel was a family with more money for flour and seed and medicine and shoes. The arithmetic of survival was changing in the valley, one seam at a time, and the woman who had started it was still standing on a ladder, driving tacks with cracked hands and a dead man's needles in her pocket. Silas Brame watched this happen the way a man watches a river change course toward his foundation. His fuel sales had not collapsed. Most families still bought coal or cut wood in quantities that kept his business profitable, but the margin was thinning. 3 families who had bought on credit the previous fall paid their notes in full by April, 2 of them crediting the lower fuel consumption of their sealed walls for the savings that made payment possible. A 4th family, one of the debtor households Silas had been pressuring, told him flatly that they intended to seal their house before next winter and would not need as much coal. Silas accepted the payment and said nothing, but the station agent told Ragnar that Silas had been seen at the depot asking about freight rates to Bismarck, which meant he was considering moving his operation to a larger market where one woman's cloth and tar could not reach. He had not yet given up on Ragnar's claim. Through May, he made 2 more inquiries, one about the outstanding hardware debt from her husband's account, which he had quietly purchased from the original creditor, and one about whether a woman's proving up could be challenged if the improvement was deemed impermanent. Neither inquiry produced a legal weapon he could use, but each one reminded Ragnar that Silas did not forget and did not forgive, and that the only answer to a patient predator was a position too strong to be taken. The answer came in June, and it came from Harlan Voss. Voss had spent the spring sealing his own cabin using the full wall method, working from what Ragnar had taught him with modifications suited to his heavier construction. His results confirmed what Ragnar already knew. The method worked on any board structure, not just her small shack. He told the county inspector as much when the man came through on his annual round, and the inspector, a practical man from Dickinson who cared about whether claims were improved, not about whether the improvements were pretty, noted in his report that Ragnar Lunde's claim showed continuous residence and substantial improvement, including an unusual but effective weatherproofing system. When Silas saw the inspector's report, which was public record, he understood that the legal route was closed. The claim was solid. The improvement was documented. The woman was staying. The resolution came not through confrontation, but through necessity, and it was more satisfying than any argument could have been. Through the summer of '87, Silas maintained his position. He sold coal at fair prices to customers who paid cash, and at punishing prices to customers who needed credit. He bought the hardware debt from Ragnar's husband's account, $11 owed to a supplier in Dickinson, who was happy to sell the note for $8 and be done with it. Silas now held paper on Ragnar's property, small as the amount was, and he mentioned it to her once, in passing, at the general store in July. Just a reminder, just a fact, just the way business worked. Ragnar paid the $11 the following week. She paid it from the earnings of 2 freight cover commissions and the trade value of seam strip work she had done for Arne Tvite's brother. She walked into Silas's store, put the coins on the counter, and asked for a receipt. Silas wrote the receipt. His hand was steady. His face showed nothing. But Ragnar saw the small muscle at the corner of his jaw tighten, and she knew what it meant. One less piece of leverage, one less hook in her claim, one less reason for her to need anything he controlled. He was not finished. Men like Silas were never finished until the economics forced them to be. But the economics were shifting, and the shift accelerated in August. A supply wagon carrying Silas's fall coal inventory overturned at the creek crossing south of the depot. The wagon cracked its axle, and the load shifted, and the canvas freight cover, a heavy tarp meant to keep the coal dry, tore across the full width when the load collapsed. The axle could be repaired by any wheelwright. The coal could be restacked. But the freight cover was destroyed, and without a cover, the coal would absorb moisture from autumn rains and lose heat value, and become harder to sell at premium prices. He needed a new freight cover, not a standard depot tarp that leaked at the seams and disintegrated in a season of hard use. He needed a treated cover, tarred, oiled, stretched tight, seamed with the kind of stitching that held under strain and shed water and lasted. The depot did not make those. The railroad did not sell those. Only one person in the valley made those, and she lived in a black house south of town. The irony was precise enough to cut glass. The man who had mocked the method needed the method. The man who had tried to buy Ragnar's failure needed to buy her skill. The economics that he had spent a year trying to bend in his favor had bent the other way, and they had bent around a piece of treated canvas. Silas Brame came to Ragna's yard on a Tuesday afternoon in late August. He came alone. He did not bring his delivery boy or his store clerk or any witness who might report the visit to the men at the depot. He stood in the yard and looked at the black house and the treated canvas drying on the frames and the tar kettles and the sail needles laid out on the workbench Ever had built from freight scraps, and he did not speak for a full minute. Ragna came out of the vestibule and stood on the step and looked at him. She did not greet him. She did not ask why he had come. She waited, because waiting was something she had learned from Winter, and it worked on men the same way it worked on storms. Eventually, they had to move. "I need a freight cover," Silas said. His voice was flat, not angry, not humble, flat, the way a voice sounds when it has been stripped of everything except the transaction. 12 by 18 feet, tarred and oiled, proper seams. Ragna did not smile. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of the mourning box or the funeral tent or the coal he had offered on credit at 8% monthly or the inquiries at the county office or the hardware debt he had purchased to hold over her head. She had won. She did not need to say so. The yard said it. The house said it. The canvas on the frame said it. She named a price, $6 for materials and labor, payable on delivery. Cash. Silas looked at her. She looked at him. The yard was quiet except for the wind moving through the treated canvas on the frames, and the wind could not get through it, and they both knew what that meant, and neither of them said it. $6, he said. Cash, she said. He nodded once. He turned and left. He came back 3 days later with the money, and Ragna gave him the cover, and he took it without a word, and the transaction was completed in full view of Arne Tveit, who had stopped to drop off a sack of beans, and Marta Kroll, who had come to borrow the sail needles for a seam job on her own cabin. The valley saw it. Nobody commented aloud. Nobody needed to. The man who had called the house a mourning box had just paid the woman who built it to make something he could not make himself, and he had paid in cash because she had not offered credit, and the symmetry of that was visible to everyone who had spent a winter watching Silas extend credit at terms designed to take what people could not afford to lose. John Ide arrived in September, following the method the way a craftsman follows a rumor about good work. He was 31, a wagon repairer from the lower Missouri country, broad across the shoulders with hands that knew wood and iron and the particular mathematics of things that carry weight. He had heard about treated canvas from a freight driver who had bought the technique from Ragna for $2 the previous winter, and he had come north to see whether the treatment could improve freight covers for the hauling trade. He expected to stay a week. He stayed longer. He found Ragna standing on a ladder in a yard full of treated canvas, driving tacks with a rhythm he recognized because it was the rhythm of someone who had done something 10,000 times and no longer needed to think about it. He stood at the edge of the yard and watched her work for 2 full minutes before she noticed him, and what he saw in those 2 minutes told him more than any conversation could have. The angle of the hammer, the spacing of the tacks, the way she checked the tension with her free hand between strikes. These were the motions of mastery, and he knew what mastery looked like because he had spent 15 years building toward his own. He asked to learn the seam method. Ragna taught him the way she taught everyone, through demonstration, through action, through the feel of the cloth under the hands and the sound of the tack meeting the batten and the tension in the line that told you whether the stretch was right. He learned fast because his hands already knew materials, and because the logic of treated canvas was not different from the logic of wagon construction. Strain distributed, joints sealed, edges reinforced, every weakness addressed before the road tested it. He came back the next week to buy treated cloth for his own freight covers. He came back the week after that to help Ragna apply summer weight panels to Birgit Hogan's cabin. He did not need to help. He wanted to. And Ragna, who who had spent a year doing most of the work alone or with an 11-year-old boy at her side, found that working beside someone whose hands moved with the same understanding as her own changed the nature of labor. It was not easier. It was less solitary, which was different from easier and in some ways more valuable. By October, he was coming every other day. They rebuilt the woodpile windbreak that Pater had designed. The A-frame had shifted over the summer and needed re-anchoring, and the work they did together had the quality of a conversation between people who speak the same language. Few words, precise actions, a shared understanding of what good work looks and feels like, and a shared impatience with work that falls short. Ragna noticed that he checked her eave seals without being asked. She noticed that he brought extra tacks and left them in the tin without mentioning it. She noticed that he spoke to Ivor as a person, not a child, asking the boy about the tar mixture's consistency, listening to the answer, adjusting his own work based on what Ivor said. She noticed that when he disagreed with her approach, and he did disagree because he was a craftsman with his own experience and his own opinions, he said so directly and without softening, the way a person speaks to an equal. One afternoon in late October, they were sealing a new section of treated canvas on the east wall of Birgit's root cellar. The sun was low, and the air was cold, and the light caught the tar surface and turned it the color of dark water. John held the cloth while Ragna tacked, and at one point their hands were both on the same section of canvas, and the tension between them was not in the cloth. She did not mistake competence for courtship, but she recognized that the two shared a border, and that John Idy was standing on it with the patience of a man who understood that trust was built the same way a good seam was built, slowly, tightly, with no gaps. They married in the spring of 1888 in a ceremony at the depot office witnessed by Marta Kroll, Harlan Voss, the station agent, and Birgit Haugen, who brought cloudberry preserves from a jar she said was the last one Pater had given her before he died. Ivor held the ring. The weather was clear and cold, and the wind blew from the northwest and hit the black walls of the shack and went nowhere, and if that was not a blessing, it was the next best thing. The years that followed are best told in specifics, not summary. In the fall of '88, John and Ragna built a proper two-room house on the claim, using new milled timber and the full canvas treatment from the ground up. John designed the frame with the joinery skills of a wagon builder, mortise and tenon joints at every corner, the kind of construction that did not shift or settle the way nailed frames did. Ragna applied the treatment. Full-wall canvas skins, tarred and oiled, stretched and tacked to Pater's specifications. The eave strips were sewn with sail needles before mounting, the stitching tight and even and waterproof. The stovepipe collar was built with the wider clearance gap she had designed. 2 vestibules, one at the front door, one at the back, created airlocks that the wind could not breach. The house was the first in the valley built with weatherproofing as a design principle rather than an afterthought, and it burned less fuel in its first winter than any structure of its size on the plain. Harlan Voss came to inspect it in November and stood in the main room and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "This is what a house should be." He went home and redesigned his own storage barn. The old shack became a workshop and storage building. Its black walls, retreated each fall, stood for another 9 years before the canvas finally degraded beyond repair. When it came down, Ivor, 19 by then, and building his own place 2 miles east, saved one of the original treated tarps and hung it in his barn. It smelled of tar and linseed oil and years, and he kept it because some things should not be discarded even when they are used up. Ragna bore 2 children, a daughter in '89 named Sigri after John's mother, and a son in '91 named Halvor after Ragna's father, the sailmaker who had started everything by pressing a child's hand against a piece of treated cloth and telling her to feel the difference. John expanded his wagon repair business to include treated freight covers, canvas windbreaks, and sealed cargo tarps for the rail trade. The freight cover work alone brought in more steady income than the claim itself. and by 93 the family had cleared all debts, improved the property beyond proving up requirements, and put enough aside to see 2 more winters without worry. The work was steady and the income was reliable, and the family grew in the way families grow when the foundation is solid and the edges are sealed, not dramatically, not with the urgency of the first winter, but with the daily accumulation of competence applied to ordinary problems. A leaking shed roof, a drafty schoolhouse, a neighbor's chicken coop that lost birds to cold every January. Each small job was a version of the same principle Ragna had learned in her father's sail loft and refined in a desperate October with tar on her hands and a clock in her head. Stop the air, and you have changed the problem. By the early 1890s, at least a dozen houses and outbuildings in the valley showed some version of Ragna's method. Not all of them used the full wall treatment. Some sealed only the north face. Some wrapped storage buildings or root cellars. Some used the seam strip method alone, the cheapest and most accessible version, the one that asked least and gave most relative to its cost. But the principle had entered the valley's knowledge the way a seed enters soil. It was there, and it grew, and each new structure that incorporated it was a structure that survived winter differently than the generation before. Marta Kroll became the method's most vocal advocate, which would have surprised the woman who had called Ragna's house a fire trap in October of '86. She taught her own neighbors, modified the technique for sod-roofed structures, and developed a method for treating grain sack cloth as a cheaper alternative to heavy freight canvas. The method was not Ragna's invention, it was Ragna's method, improved by Marta's practicality, which is how useful knowledge works. It changes hands and gets better each time. Harlan Voss sealed his new barn with the full treatment in '92 and reported that his livestock losses in winter dropped by half. He credited the tighter structure, not the woman who taught him, but he sent his son to learn the seam technique from Ragna directly, which was credit of a different kind. Silas Brame relocated his primary operation to Bismarck in the spring of 1890. The valley's fuel demand had not disappeared, but it had changed enough that the margins no longer supported the kind of credit and foreclosure business model he preferred. 3 winters of tighter houses had not ruined him, but they had thinned his leverage, and a man like Silas needed leverage the way a stove needed draft. Without it, the whole operation choked. He sold his Medora property to a younger merchant named Tolef Grindheim, who sold coal at fair prices and did not extend credit at 8% monthly, and who, within a year of arriving, had his own storage shed wrapped on the windward face with treated canvas he bought from John Eady's freight cover operation. The day Silas loaded his wagon and drove east toward Bismarck, Ragna was in her yard treating a fresh batch of canvas for a neighbor's root cellar. She watched him pass on the road. The wagon was heavy, and the horses pulled slow, and the road was muddy from spring thaw. He did not look at the black house. She did not wave. Some endings do not require gestures. The valley knew what had happened, and the valley would remember, and that was enough. Ragna Lunda Ida lived in the valley for the rest of her life. She died in 1923 at the age of 61, the same age Pater Flatten had been when he taught her to seal an eave. John had preceded her by 2 years, taken by pneumonia in a winter that was ordinary by Dakota standards. Ivor outlived them both. He farmed his own claim until 1940 and told anyone who asked about the Black House, and most people by then did not ask because the principle it demonstrated, that tightness matters more than thickness, that stopping air is as important as generating heat, had become so obvious that it no longer seemed like something a person had needed to discover. But someone had needed to discover it. Or rather, someone had needed to remember it, to reach back to a sail loft in Haugesund and pull a dead man's lesson forward across an ocean and a continent and apply it to a box of boards on a frozen plain with $11 and a brother and no time. Ragna taught 7 families directly in the 3 years after the winter of '86 to '87. She sealed one widow's north wall with treated canvas strips. She wrapped one root cellar roof in a skirt of oiled cloth. She built one bunkhouse vestibule from scrap lumber and freight canvas. She repaired one freight shed with a windward face that had been leaking since the day it was raised. The number was small. The arithmetic it changed was not. She lived out her years in the two-room house she and John built on the claim in 1888. The house still used the treated canvas method on its north and west walls through every winter of her life. And when she was old and her hands were too stiff for the tar work, Ivar came from his own place and resealed the eaves each fall, using Peter's sail needles and the waxed thread from the toolbox that sat on Ragna's workbench for 36 years. She died in her bed in October of 1923, with the north wind pushing against the wall beside her and the wall pushing back. On a cold morning in the winter of 1895, 8 years after the storm, a child too young to remember that first winter stood in the yard and looked at the old shack, still standing, still black, still wrapped tight on all four walls. The snow was bright everywhere. The canvas was dark. The child asked why the shed looked like that, and a man passing on the road laughed and said it looked less like a shed than a mourning box. Marta Kroll was crossing the yard at that moment, and she stopped and looked at the man the way a woman looks at someone who has said something ignorant in the presence of something important. "That mourning box," Marta said, "kept two people alive when your kind of house would have killed them." The man rode on. The child forgot the exchange. But the house stood, and the wind pressed against it, and the treated canvas held, and inside the walls the air was still. Ragna Lunde laid her hand flat on the sun-warmed dark surface and felt the heat in the cloth and the silence behind it, the silence where the wind used to be.